Thank you. I'm very happy to help out. Already want to congratulate Lotte with her upcoming PhD. And thank you for all the work you've done in Dutch rowing. Also on behalf of our federation, I want to congratulate you on your achievement. As I said, I'm happy to fill in. I did a research study a couple of years ago on this university on concurrent rowing or concurrent training in rowing. And that's what I want to talk to you about. But not only from a research point of view, but also from a practical point of view. So, okay, concurrent training, what is it? But also how do we handle it in our daily practice? As you are probably all aware, rowing is not simple an endurance sport. It takes about, on elite level, about, let's say 6-7 minutes to finish a race. But a large portion of that race is really high intensity, especially in the beginning and at the end, when you see the rowers have to speed up the boat, or they have to do an end spurt. The exercise is really anaerobic. Usually we call it the phase in between that, let's say the distance phase, we call it aerobic, but still it's really high intensity. So all the time, a rower has to deliver a high power output and also maintain that power output for about, let's say 6-7 minutes. So actually, I think if you want to characterize a rower, it has to be somewhere in between these two athletes. They are both runners, so but if you look at them, there's a big difference in body composition. So if you look on the left side, the sprint athlete, so he's really buffy muscle type of guy. On the right side, and I even stretched the picture out a bit, but it's a really it's a really thin marathon runner, but really fast on the long distance. And what I want to do with you is to look at the muscles of these athletes, because I think that's really important. So what I try to do in these drawings is more or less cut a muscle fiber straight through. So you're just looking into a muscle fiber at this moment. And if you look at on the left-hand side, let's say the blue muscle, you can see it's quite a large fiber compared to the one on the right. You see some black dots in the muscle. These represent mitochondria, the energy factories of the muscle. And if you compare it with the marathon runner, you see there are far less mitochondria in this muscle, even though let's say the muscle itself is bigger. So the concentration of the mitochondria is way smaller. If you look on the side, you see these red dots. Those red dots represent blood vessels, really small vessels around the muscle fiber that also have been cut through. What these vessels do is they supply the muscle with oxygen, but also with energy sources. And ideally, you want all these, let's say, all the oxygen that's floating around here in these vessels directed towards the center of the muscle. And as you can see, it's the distance to the center is way longer in this muscle than in the endurance muscle. That's a big difference. Well, another big difference is the number of the mitochondria, as I already said, but also the number of small blood vessels around the vessel. So physiologically, everything in the endurance runner is aimed at getting as much oxygen as possible to the center of the muscle fiber, where it can be used by the mitochondria. That's a big difference between those two athletes. So keep that in mind. We've got these two sides of the spectrum. So on one end, there's the high power output rower has to achieve. On the other hand, it's the endurance. And the rower has to maintain that high power output for a long time. So if we train a rower for a high power output, then this cascade is a simplified version of what happens biochemically. You can forget about it straight away. What you have to remember is that it's all aimed at the synthesis of contractile proteins in a muscle. If you make these proteins, what you will see is that the muscle will get bigger and it can generate a higher peak power output. As I said, forget about the left-hand figure, but remember this one, mTOR. It serves an important role in this whole process. Keep that in mind when we go to the next slide, which is now. The same kind of figure, completely different, but forget about it straight away as well. It's an easy story, yeah. But this is what happens biochemically if you want to train for an endurance adaptation. Again, you have exercise, and in the end, it leads to two main effects. Now, which is the biogenesis of mitochondria, so the energy factories that are in the muscle, but also the creation of these small blood vessels that lie around the muscle, as I showed in the previous picture. Those are two important effects. And we see these, this thing called AMPK, AMP activated protein kinase. Remember that one as well. So do you still remember the first one? mTOR. Oh, yes, I'm at the university. Very good, very good. So we've got mTOR and we've got AMPK. Let's see what happens if we train for both, which happens in rowing. So you have to train for the endurance and you have to train for the high peak power. Again, a really nice figure. And I remember this one. You have the mTOR over here. This is part of the process that if you do resistance training, it goes via a cascade through mTOR and it yields to protein synthesis. So the muscle becomes bigger, hypertrophies. On the other end, we've got the endurance training, which leads via AMPK to a greater aerobic capacity, so a muscle can deliver prolonged exercise. But the interesting thing is that AMPK also can inhibit mTOR. So if you do endurance training, it can lead to an inhibited response if it comes to the development of greater peak power. So through this pathway. If you take that together and zoom out a bit again, we've got these two sides. You can more or less see it as a scale. On one hand, you've got the mitochondrial biogenesis. On the other side, you've got the muscle hypertrophy. And those two, you can more or less see it as a scale. And depending on what kind of stimulus you give, you get some certain adaptation. And as I said, for rowing, you want both adaptations. You want the muscle to become stronger, simply said, but also you want the muscle to be able to deliver that power output for a long time. So it's always a continuum somewhere in between these two types of athletes. Then I come to the title of this presentation, which is concurrent training, or in Dutch, concurrerende training. You can probably imagine what it means. As I said, it's these both effects, but they can inhibit each other, so they are each other's concurrent. This is not a new observation. It's already discovered in the 80s in a nice paper by Hickson, who actually looked at the inhibition of strength development when strength training and endurance training are combined. You can see that in this figure, and I especially want you to look at the left-hand side figure. What you see in this figure is a training block of about 10 weeks. So on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, what he shows is I think it's the weight that the rowers can deadlift. The development of that weight over time. They either do endurance training, which is the E in this figure. They either do strength training, which is the S, or a combination of both, so the strength plus endurance. Okay, let's first look at the strength training. When they do the strength training, is this upper figure. They start at about 96 kilograms, and throughout this period of training, they increase the weight they can lift to about 140. This is quite a lot. On the other hand, if they do endurance training, you can see, okay, what happens with the strength capacity. Well, it increases a bit as well. So they start over here and they end over here. But it's, of course, logically, it's way less than if they do strength training. But then, interestingly, the combination, so the concurrent training, they do both strength training and endurance training. What you see then is that there is an increase in strength in the beginning, but at some point it flattens off. And this is actually the concurrent training effect. So there's an inhibition of strength development when you train for as well strength as endurance. And that's really interesting, because in rowing, actually this is what happens. Rowers do strength training and they do endurance training. So when you develop a training schedule for rowing, you really have to take this into account. At the National Training Center, we do take this into account, but it's quite hard to handle it. And in the next few slides, I want to explain to you how we try to tackle this, let's say, problem. First, I need to give a bit of a background on that. And some of you might recognize this figure. This is a figure of the dissertation of Stefan van der Zwaart, who is also a PhD student at this faculty. And this figure shows how a muscle coop would look for different kind of athletes. So first over here, we've got it's over here on the left side, let's say the red dot, is an endurance athlete. So what you see, it can deliver a certain exercise, and it can maintain it for the intensity for a long time. So the coop shows really aerobically developed fibers. On the other end, we've got let's say the sprint fibers over here. And you can see the difference between those two is that the cross-through sections of the muscle fibers they're way bigger, as I showed you in the simple drawings before. And a rower is somewhere in between, I think. So I put it over here, or Stefan put it over there. But also the muscle fibers somewhere in between. So let's say over there. So what would be an ideal situation if you train for rowing? I think it would be something like this. You want this whole curve to more or less shift a bit to the upward right position, because it means that the muscle fibers, they grow, they get bigger, but still they are able to maintain the exercise intensity for a long time, because the endurance capacity also grows. So this, I think, would be the wanted situation if you train in rowing. Okay, but how do we do that? Because if you train for one hand on the one side of the spectrum, it might lead to a reduction in the other end, or the other end of the spectrum. So, for example, if you make a muscle thicker, stronger, it hypertrophies, it can lead that the muscle will fatigue faster. So, you won't be able to maintain a certain exercise intensity for the same amount of time. That can happen. It's a concurrent training effect. So the question actually is, do we want to improve the strong points, improve one end, or say, okay, if someone is already a very strong endurance athlete, it might be better to put strings a bit more tight on the other end, so make him a bit stronger. Or do we want, if someone is a good endurance athlete, make him benefit from that aspect a bit more? So I think that's an interesting question. But hard to answer. I think if you want to answer it, you need to have more information. It's everyone reacts differently to different training stimulus. And actually, what you want to know is how much is there to gain on each side of the spectrum for both kind of athletes. So let's say the endurance athletes and the sprinter types. So you need to have information on that. So we try to gather information on this aspect, and we did that on one end by looking at muscle architecture, meaning, okay, how does the muscle actually look? And what we do know, this is also data collected in our own rowers, is if the muscle volume increases. This is the muscle volume of the vastus lateralis. The muscle volume increases. The peak power output that is delivered during a Wingate test. A Wingate test is a test for high power outputs on a bike. You just actually simply see, okay, the larger the volume, the higher the power output. But interestingly, there's a big difference between individuals. So there are, in this case, there are three rowers who have the same volume of the vastus lateralis. So the muscle volume is, the muscle is of the same size. But still there's a difference of 500 watts in peak power output, which is a lot. This is of interest, because how is that possible? How the muscle is the same size, and still there's such a big difference in power output. I've got some suggestions. I think muscle fiber type might play an important role. So what kind of muscle fibers are in there? Is it type 1 fibers, type 2 fibers? Makes a big difference. But also the length of the muscle fibers. Because how much power a muscle fiber can generate is not only dependent on how thick it is, but also on how fast it can contract. And that speed of contraction depends a lot on the length of the muscle. So therefore I think it's not only the fiber type, but also the length of the muscles that is really important. And we can train the length of muscle fibers. You can do it, for example, by plyometric training. You see speed skaters do that kind of training a lot. They do the schaatsprongen like this. I'm so bad at this. Like this. They're just maintaining the most extreme situation. That's kind of a plyometric training. It serves the purpose to increase the length of the muscle fibers and thereby increase let's say, a high power output that's possible within that muscle. Okay, we want to have more information on that, the muscle architecture. So one good way to find it out, how does the muscle look, is just simple put a needle in it, get a bit of muscle out of it and see how it looks. So how thick are the vessels, how does it look? It looks something like this. And actually I think that's really, really useful information to have. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to do. Not that I don't think rowers would object it. I don't think coaches would object it, but it's just not easy to put a muscle in human subjects without complying with all the regulations. I don't know why. So fortunately we work together here with this faculty. With another PhD student, Guido Weide, and he developed a technique to monitor from the outside, so non-invasively have a look at how the muscle looks. It's kind of a setup like this. Someone sits in a chair where his leg is fixed, and then with an ultrasound probe, the same probe you use to check when someone's pregnant, if it's a boy or a girl, you just move over the muscle, and by really closely looking at the position of that probe, you can reconstruct the muscle. So you can reconstruct, okay, from the beginning to the end, how many fibers are in there, what's the length of the fibers, what is the physiological cross-sectional area of the muscle. So you can get a lot of information out of it if you do it really nicely. So you don't need to put a needle in there. You can just going to Guido in the hospital for half an hour gives a lot of information. And then you can get to you get more insight. And okay, how does the muscle look? How long are the fibers? Is there still a potential for lengthening the muscle fibers? We had last year we had a small experiment where the rowers went 2 times to do this. One baseline measurement, and then 8 weeks later they went again. And the period in between, they did all these crazy jumps, all the plyometric training, just to see, okay, how effective is this training actually? Is it possible to lengthen the muscle fibers to make them more explosive? There's this one big advantage of making the muscles longer instead of thicker, and that has to do with concurrent training. Because if you make a muscle longer, it can still be very aerobic. So still all the oxygen can get to the center of the muscle, and it can maintain the high power output for a long time. So that's actually the trick we want to employ. And the findings, I think the findings are really interesting because it shows that not all the, let's say about 50% of the rowers just do not react at all to the plyometric training. So there's little potential for this type of training to make the muscles longer or the muscle fibers longer and get a nice effect. So then you can ask yourself, okay, is it worth doing it again? If there's such a little effect with this type of training, it's perhaps better to try to look at different solutions. So we got a lot of information out of this, and we did not need to put a needle into the muscle. There's one other thing which I'd like to talk to you about, and I've only got a couple more minutes, so I'll finish off with this one, and that's when looking at oxygen delivery to the muscles. As you might know, if you measure the VO2 max, the maximal oxygen consumption, and this value is determined by in a simplified situation by three factors. It's the ventilation, so how much air do you inspire and get to your circulation, which is the second part. So when it is in your blood, it still has to reach your muscles. And then the third part, and also not unimportant, is the oxygen consumption by the muscles itself. So these three blocks, they lead to oxygen consumption value, which is of interest because it means that if you measure this value, it is also determined by these three radars. So they all have to work together to reach a high oxygen uptake. And it's, I think for Rowing it's really interesting to see, okay, where is the limitation located? Is it by the supply of oxygen? Or is it by the use of oxygen by the muscles? We know from other athletes, let's say mid-level athletes, that the limitation is almost always located in the delivery of oxygen to the muscles. There's about a 10% overcapacity on mitochondria in the muscles, which leads to a limitation that's always centrally located. But we wanted to know, is that also true for our top-level rowers? We did the next experiment. We made changes to the oxygen delivery during our VO2 max test. So what we did is we have a standard VO2 max test. One test was just normoxia, a normal oxygen content of the air, 21%. But we did the same test, but then with hyperoxia, meaning they, instead of breathing normal air, they breathed hyperoxic air, about 40% oxygen. And on foreign we actually thought, okay, two situations can happen. The VO2 max remains equal, so it's the same for the normoxic air and the hyperoxic air, which would mean that the limitation is located peripherally, so in the muscle, because it means that if you supply the muscle with way more oxygen, almost double as much, and it does not use that oxygen, the oxygen is not used by the muscle, remember the three radars, then the limitation has to be in the muscle. It can also happen another thing, and that is that the VO2 max is higher when you supply more oxygen, meaning that the limitation would be in the supply of oxygen to the muscle. Again, there were two groups of rowers. So there were some rowers who actually had the same VO2 max in hyperoxia and normoxia. It was a small group, but still on the group of 20, it was about 6 rowers who had it. So the majority behaved like we more or less expected, showing a higher VO2 max if you supply more oxygen. But this means that you can specify training, especially training on altitude camps, to induce adaptations that are beneficial for the individual. So if you go to altitude and you, for example, you do a lot of high intensity work on altitude, so you create a large oxygen depth in the muscle, it yields different adaptations, mainly adaptations in the muscle. If you do a lot of, let's say, low intensity work, you create mainly central adaptations. So this is actually the second example of getting more information to make the right decisions if it comes to training. And I think I want to conclude with this one. Thank you very much.